Late in the afternoon of November 333 BC, near the small coastal town of Issus, the Persian king Darius III deployed his army north of the Pinaris River. His position cut off the communication and supply lines of Alexander the Great's army, which was advancing south along the coast. On the horizon, he saw Alexander's army advancing toward him. Alexander was informed that his army was in danger of being trapped in extremely hostile territory. As they deployed in front of the Persians, they realized that their only way out was victory. The alternative was a bitter fight to the death. The fate of two great empires hung in the balance as the two sides prepared to clash with all the ferocity of ancient warfare. After Alexander's victory at the Battle of the Granicus, the road to Persia was open to him. He marched his army south, liberating numerous Greek city-states along the western coast of Asia. These city-states were ruled by oligarchs and Persian-oriented tyrants. In most cases, the city-states fled as soon as they learned of Alexander's advance. The Persian commander of Sardis, Mithrinus, voluntarily surrendered to Alexander. Eventually, he was rewarded for his meek submission with the rule of Armenia. However, many cities fiercely resisted Alexander. This was partly because they preferred the devil they knew to the one they did not. It was also because Memnon of Rhodes, appointed by Darius as commander of the western satrapies, and the Persian fleet prevented them from opening their gates. Miletus and Halicarnassus were the two main strongholds that fiercely resisted Alexander's advance. Miletus enjoyed the support of the Persian fleet. Philotas, commander of Alexander's cavalry, moved to occupy Mycale, preventing ships from reaching the military base. The city was captured shortly thereafter. Taking Halicarnassus was difficult. It was defended by Memnon of Rhodes and Orontobates, and Alexander initially attempted to seize it diplomatically. This proved unsuccessful, so he quickly built a series of earthworks around the city and bombarded it with his artillery. After a fierce battle in which Macedonian infantry stormed the city, its commanders set it on fire and abandoned it. Much of the city was destroyed in the ensuing inferno, but Alexander triumphed once again. After liberating the Greek cities on the western coast, Alexander's army planned to advance deeper into Asia Minor. At this point, he had a fleet of 160 triremes. This fleet was expensive to maintain, and the Persian fleet outnumbered it by at least 3 times. The king decided that he could not win a naval battle against the Persians, and that the money would be better spent on penetrating deeper into Asia Minor. He disbanded his fleet, retaining only the Athenian fleet, primarily to secure his army's supply lines. His commanders opposed this move. Dismantling the fleet would have allowed the Persian fleet to launch raids on the Greek mainland and possibly cut off the army heading for Asia Minor, a scenario that was not entirely unlikely. However, Alexander concluded that his soldiers were fighting better, knowing that retreat was impossible and distrusting most of the Greek city-states that supplied the fleet. His strategy was to invade the Persian and Phoenician naval bases along the coast his army crossed. It was an extremely ambitious and daring plan. Many of the senior commanders deserted the young king, who contracted a fever during this period. Meanwhile, King Darius III, stationed to the east, was zealously strengthening his army. He had assembled an army the likes of which the world had never seen. They set out from Babylon to meet Alexander in the Anatolian peninsula. This imperial army consisted of Iranian cavalry, Mesopotamian infantry, and around 30,000 Greek mercenaries. Alexander's historians Curtius, Justin, Diodorus, and Arrian estimated the number of soldiers at between 312,000 and 600,000. Meanwhile, Alexander, having recovered from his fever, continued his march east. At Gordium, a new challenge awaited him. The Gordian knot was a legendary knot said to have been tied by the ancient Phrygian king Gordius. According to legend, a soothsayer foretold that whoever untied the knot would become the ruler of Asia. The knot was extremely complex and tangled, and many tried to untie it without success. Legend has it that instead of untying it, Alexander simply used his sword to cut it. he was well on his way to becoming the ruler of Asia. Meanwhile, Memnon actively tried to rally support for a rebellion in Alexander's rear. Sparta was preparing for war, and an Athenian faction was said to be planning a mutiny when Memnon died during the siege of Mytilene, the Persian naval base. His sudden death halted any naval strategies or mutiny, albeit briefly. Pharnabazus replaced him as commander of the Persian fleet. Desperate for allies against Alexander, he met with the Spartan king Aegeis to incite a mutiny in the Peloponnese. Darius's scouts learned that Alexander had crossed the Taurus Mountains and captured Tarsus shortly thereafter. His army was not yet fully prepared and equipped, but the Persian king felt that time was crucial. Initially, Darius wanted to stay there because the Syrian plain allowed him to fully exploit his numerical superiority. But when Parmenion captured Issus and Alexander passed through, leaving it as a base for his sick and wounded, the Persian king saw an ideal opportunity to isolate his enemy. He besieged Alexander's army, cutting it off from its base at Issus. The Macedonian king was surprised by the shift in the army's positions. With hostile territory to his south, Alexander had no choice but to turn and fight. They said, "Our enemies are the Medes and Persians, men who have lived in luxury and comfort for centuries. We Macedonians, however, have been trained for generations in the school of danger and cruel warfare." Alexander to his troops before the Battle of Issus. The armies met a few miles south of Issus. The number of troops each fielded is disputed. Darius likely outnumbered Alexander. He mustered up to 100,000 troops. This included 11,000 cavalry, 10,000 immortals, and 10,000 Greek mercenaries. Alexander mustered only between 30,000 and 40,000 troops. This included approximately 24,000 heavy infantry, 13,000 light infantry, and up to 6,000 cavalry. Darius deployed his army on a coastal plain north of the Pinarus River. His army stretched for about 3 miles. Most of the inexperienced troops were stationed on either side of the Persians. The vanguard consisted of a line of archers. The centre consisted of 2,000 members of Darius's elite royal guard. He commanded them from their ranks, stationed in a massive chariot. Ornate. The royal guard was surrounded by about 30,000 Greek mercenaries and 60,000 carefully selected infantry, called kardaki, professional heavy infantry. These were deployed around the Greek mercenaries. The royal cavalry stood close to the king. To the far right stood the Persian heavy cavalry, south of the Gulf of Issus. On the farthest hills to his left, Darius sent a detachment of light infantry to encircle Alexander's right flank. By late afternoon, Alexander's army arrived on the scene. Darius's cavalry withdrew. Their protective barrier prevented them from adequately assessing the Persian positions. Alexander noticed the Persian cavalry retreating to the right flank, closer to the shore. With the Persian cavalry facing his left, Alexander decided it was best to deploy the Thessalonian cavalry to reinforce that flank, rather than their original right position. The infantry phalanx was positioned in the centre. Parmenion commanded all those on their left. The cavalry initially remained behind the phalanx, concealing their movement. His companion cavalry, an elite cavalry unit, reinforced the right flank, their movement restricted by the hills. On the far right were the Gracians, a Thracian tribe, accompanied by archers and lightly armed infantry. Alexander realized that the Persian infantry was surrounding him from the hills and ordered the Gracians to repel them. The soldiers fought in the hills without actually engaging in battle. Darius's cavalry on the right flank launched their first attack, crossing the river and confronting Parmenion and his cavalry. Despite the fierce attack, Parmenion bravely resisted. While the cavalry fought, Alexander ordered the rest of his army to advance. The goal was for Parmenion to hold off the Persian cavalry long enough for Alexander's right flank to defeat the Persians and eliminate the remaining enemy. Instead, things did not go well for Alexander's army. As the phalanx advanced and crossed the river, it encountered difficulty reaching the fortified bank. Beyond the bank, Greek mercenaries were ready to confront them. Arrian describes how 120 of the most prominent Macedonian commanders were killed almost immediately, and the phalanx was forced to retreat. While this situation persisted, the cavalry on the left slowly repelled the powerful and aggressive Persian cavalry. However, Alexander and his men, Hypaspestes, also launched an attack. They encountered the Cardassians. A fierce battle ensued nearby. Despite the professionalism of both types of soldiers, Hypaspestes seemed to prevail. Cracks appeared in the Persian ranks as Alexander and his men fought Hypaspestes. On his far right, the agrarians launched raids against the Persian skirmishers. During the fierce fighting, Alexander mounted a horse and led his comrades in an attack on Darius, who was among the fighters. According to Plutarch, Alexander confronting Darius. In this battle he received a sword wound in his thigh. According to Charis, this wound was from Darius, who had engaged him in hand-to-hand combat. Alexander sent a letter to Antipater describing the battle, but he did not mention who had inflicted the wound. He merely said that he had been stabbed in the thigh with a dagger and that the wound was not serious. The attack of the companion on the Persian bodyguards was fierce. The guard ranks wobbled, and some of the most battle-hardened Persian bodyguards were defeated. Darius also turned and decided it was best to leave the battlefield. Instead of pursuing the king, Alexander realized that the left and center were in trouble. The Greek mercenaries continued a bitter fight against the Macedonian phalanx in the center. The defeated Persian nucleus provided the resources needed to reinforce the struggling phalanx. Alexander allowed his Macedonian cavalry enough room to move freely, despite the narrow terrain. He launched an attack on the rear of the Greek mercenaries in the center. Although he held while the Macedonian phalanx was overrun, an attack on their flanks and rear turned the tide. Many of the mercenaries were defeated, or would have fled if they could. Any other Persian soldiers still engaged in the fighting realized that the king had fled, and that most of the flanks were being crushed. The army's position deteriorated into a complete rout. Alexander ordered his cavalry to pursue the fleeing soldiers for as long as possible to them. It is estimated that the Persians lost around 20,000 soldiers, although generous estimates place the number at over 100,000, including 10,000 cavalry under Arrian, Curtius, and Plutarch. Justin gives the same total, detailing 61,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 40,000 prisoners. The discrepancy between these figures and the reported Macedonian losses of less than 500 men is difficult to reconcile with a realistic scenario. Alexander's army likely lost around 7,000 soldiers. When the Persian king fled, he left behind his decorated chariot, cloak, shield, and bow. Alexander captured his battle camp, including his mother, wife, son, and 2 daughters. The victory at Issus was Alexander's second major victory in Persian territory. However, it was not decisive. Up to 10,000 Greek mercenaries fled, and the Persian king fled to the heart of his empire to raise another army. This victory allowed Alexander to move his campaign south. He turned his sights on Egypt. Parmenion soon captured Damascus. He captured a wealth of treasure and civilians, suggesting that Darius intended to make the city a forward base for his military operations. Alexander's goal was to consolidate his hold on the newly conquered territories. He appointed his governors, Antigonus the One-Eyed, Ptolemy, and Balarus. Their goal was to crush any opposition behind the front lines. To further legitimize the situation, he married one of Darius's daughters, Statira II. News of his victory at Issus spread widely, and Alexander did not complete the conquest.